This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net, and it is time for Avoid the Maze. The maze, it's your journey through life. We are all going through it, and I guarantee you that my guest today, Dr. Bruce Chalmer, is going to tell us that, yep, there is a maze, but we do have choices. And sometimes we think we don't, that we have to keep going along the same path, hitting that brick wall. And that's not really enjoying life at all. When I read your bio, Dr. Bruce, one of the things I noticed is that you talk about couples therapy. And there are so many people out there who are afraid of therapy itself, let alone couples therapy. So tell us how you got into this field and how you help couples, because my husband and I have been married 41 years, and we have not been on the same page all 41 years. And sometimes it's really good because it gets one of us to be very mindful to say, hey, maybe your way is a better way. Or sometimes we compromise, or other times I just get in the car and drive to the park and stare at the beautiful trees and calm myself down. So welcome to Avoid the Maze.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. You've kind of laid out some interesting questions already.
So when did you get started in all this, and why?
So my path was I think this is true of a lot of folks, I guess. I am now in my mid 70s. I'm about to turn 74, and I've been doing this for about 30 years. So if you do the math on that, I didn't get into private practice until I was already in my 40s. This was not a career right out of college. I actually was a statistician for a while. I got involved in that through a rather circuitous route too, but I was always good at math and I enjoyed it. And I even wrote a statistics textbook back in the 80s. And I taught it for a while. And then I ended up getting a PhD in psychology because the University of Vermont, where I got my master's degree in statistics, didn't have a PhD in statistics. And I had done my master's work in a very psychological area. So I was already familiar with some of the folks in the psych department, and they let me in and said, sure. So I got my PhD on the research side of things of psychology. And then along the way, the marriage I was in, since I had been very young, I got married the first time at 20, um, went through some really hard times. And I can tell you the brief story, and this is fast forward a bit. The brief story of my first marriage is that both my ex and I have gone on to marry really wonderful women, and we're both a lot happier. That's basically
Okay.
what happened there. So worked out a lot better. We all get along fine now. But it was painful. And in the course of doing that, I experienced individual therapy and I experienced some couples therapy. And I found it so powerful. And I realized, wow, this is something I want to do. It felt, that the work I'd been doing before, I was doing things that I was good at, I enjoyed okay, but they didn't feel like a calling. This felt like a calling. This felt like something that was really, it just resonated deeply with who I am. So I got trained, I got the clinical training because I didn't have that part, and, did my internship and got my license. And I did a fair amount of individual therapy early on. But early on, I got a lot of training in family therapy and couples therapy. And I started focusing more and more on couples. I just found the work with couples to be so compelling. There's something about it where it's so immediate. There are folks who do therapy who are really drawn to the sort of long-term, almost, the psychoanalytic approach or things like that. And my earliest training was in psychodynamic, which is sort of an offshoot of psychoanalysis. I found it very helpful, but it just didn't speak to me the way couples work does because it's so immediate and it's so, they're facing very high stakes and they're very motivated. What their motivations are can vary, of course, but
Sure.
I just feel like, wow, I can help with this. And over the years, it's funny, of course I get better at it because, you have experience, you get better at it. The thing I got most better at, I think, was not freaking out myself. It's
Okay.
basically the therapist's main contribution is to be the one in the room who's not freaking out.
Right.
Because if I'm freaking out, I'm kind of useless to the couple, you know? If I'm not freaking out, I can then be curious and invite them to be curious. And that's the stance that will get them unstuck. That's the stance that helps you avoid the maze.
Sure.
You know, the maze, it's funny. I did recently I did a Substack on I just started using Substack, by the way. I'll put in a plug for it. Um, I did a Substack on the dread disease of hardening of the categories. I love that term, hardening of the categories. Somebody came up with a word for it. They called it psychosclerosis.
Okay.
It's meant to be a bit whimsical, but it's that sense, you know, when you talk about avoiding the maze, it's avoiding that hardening of ideas into ideology so that you can't think anymore. And when couples come in to see me, they are both often in that very hardened state. And what I'm modeling and inviting them to do is rather than be in that hardened state, say, well, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. I wonder where you're coming from here. And if you're not freaking out, you can do that. Anyway, I put a whole
No,
lot in that one answer, but I got into it through my own experience. I found it very compelling. I've been loving to do it ever since, and I'm still doing it, even though I'm in my 70s. I'm still doing it because I love doing it.
well, there's one major thing that resonates with me, and I think it's important for our listeners to understand. I love how the fact you said, hey, I didn't get into this field until I was in my 40s.
Hmm.
You and I grew up in the same era. I'm
Hmm.
a year older than you. So I
Hmm.
know what the 50s and 60s were like. I know what our parents were telling us. You're going to go to school, you're going to get a degree, you're going to get a job, and you'll be fine for the next 50 years.
Hmm.
Our generation sort of did that, but we started realizing that there's more to just this job that we're doing. We
Hmm.
want to see maybe something else is out there. And so, unlike our parents, we were changing jobs a little more frequently, or at least the direction we wanted to go in our job.
Yeah.
Uh, and so, I'm hoping our listeners will understand. I don't care if you're 20 years old and you want to make a change, or if you're 70 years old and want to make a change. I held on to all those old beliefs until I was in my 60s. And I
Mm.
woke up one day saying, I still have a lot of years ahead of me. What am I doing? Why do I feel useless?
Mm.
And when I said it to my husband, he looked at me and he gave me a list of all these wonderful things I can do, including cleaning the house and cooking and grocery shopping, and you've held down great jobs and, you can go out and get another job. And it's like, hey, I'm in my 60s. Most people aren't going to want to hire me. So I can keep trying, but maybe I have to recreate me.
Hmm.
And that initially became a problem, not for him, but for me. I was so afraid I was going to change so much that we were going to split up.
Mm. Yeah.
So I took it in baby steps. So, how do you help specifically? I'm sure you talk to couples of all ages,
Hmm.
but what about the couples that I'm hearing about who are now in their 60s and 70s and saying, boy, this is not where I really want to be? How do you give up that lifetime to make a change later in
Mm.
life?
Yeah, I actually do see quite a few people, and indeed across the age range, 20s through, I've had couples in their 80s, so, and everything in between. Yeah, it's always the prospect of doing therapy is always anxiety producing. If it isn't, you're missing something, you know, you're not paying attention. Because it needs to be because in fact you are something is not working typically, you know, nobody ever makes an appointment with me just to tell me how well everything is going.
Right.
It just doesn't happen, you know. In the old statistics world, we would refer to that as a biased sample, not a random sample of people. You know, it's like, hey, how come everybody has a problem? Well, that's why they're consulting me, isn't it?
That's right.
So everybody's there and they're anxious about something. And that phenomenon of having to challenge some of our assumptions is always unsettling. You know, the assumptions we make, and typically we make a lot of assumptions without even realizing we're making them. To challenge those can feel really unsettling. You never know where it's going to lead. And indeed, that fear that people have that if they go into couples therapy or even into individual therapy, they're going to end up splitting up. That's not a crazy fear. That happens. That does happen. It's a risk that people are taking. I have a video that I made, especially this is for heterosexual couples. Overwhelmingly, guess which one is the one wanting to do couples therapy? The
Well,
man or the woman?
the woman, of course.
Of course, right. Women want to talk about this stuff, right? You're the ones who want to talk about it. We men are the ones who are terrified of talking about it. Of course, we won't admit that we're terrified because we're men. So, but we'll find a zillion reasons why it's a bad idea to do. But basically, it's fear. I did a video called How to Get Your Reluctant Guy to Go to Couples Therapy or to try couples therapy. And my basic point of that video is the reason the guy is afraid is he has actually good reason to be afraid. He won't admit he's afraid. He'll give you all kinds of, rational sounding reasons like, well, you're the one who's unhappy, you should go or whatever. But basically it's fear. And the way that a woman can get a man to go, or at least consider going, is by recognizing his fear is valid. It doesn't work to argue with him. It doesn't work to tell him, well, you don't care about me, because that tends almost always not true. He does care. He's just terrified. He's terrified he'll lose her. And he's got good reason. So when she recognizes, oh, you actually have good reason to be afraid, then it becomes possible for him to consider, well, I am afraid, but I see what you're saying. It's like, yeah, we're in trouble, aren't we? I don't want to see it, but you're telling me we're in trouble and I don't want to lose you. So I suppose I'll take that risk, but recognize it is a risk. So to make those changes you're describing invariably involves, one of my favorite phrases that I talk about. My wife and I do a podcast, and we once I've joked with her that if people had a drinking game where every time they heard me say this particular phrase, they took a shot, they'd be plastered by the end of many of our episodes. It's tolerate the anxiety. It's about tolerating the anxiety. Any sort of honest, deep conversation, and the word I use for that, by the way, is intimacy. Any sort of intimate conversation involves anxiety. You don't know where it's going to go. To be honest with yourself and honest with each other, which is what I mean basically by intimacy, it's a pretty broad definition, involves tolerating anxiety. That's the chief skill of intimacy. So that's, you know, what can I do to help a couple tolerate that anxiety? One of the things I do in the first session is almost always I give a little mini lecture on the two needs we're trying to fulfill in a couple, stability and intimacy. And I talk about the fact that intimacy, which is every bit as much a need as stability is, but intimacy requires tolerating anxiety. And so I kind of set it up that way. And then, tolerating anxiety without freaking out is the chief skill.
It's interesting. I look back at my first marriage and I held on to anger for a very, very long time. We did not go to therapy. Our breakup just happened very, very quickly. And neither one of us ever really talked about it.
Mhm.
And so I was angry,
Mhm.
like, and I thought, what was wrong with me? And I walked around for a long time saying that. Even when I first started dating, after that, we were married 7 years. If somebody would call me up and ask me out, first thing I'd say is, why do you want to go out with me? I mean, I was sabotaging myself, but
Yeah.
didn't understand I was doing that. Um, when I met my current husband, and we're married 41 years, so obviously there's nothing really wrong with me, but I was wrong in that relationship. And it
Mm.
took me a long time to understand, wait a second, it wasn't one-sided.
Mhm.
Okay. No, we never talked about it, but now I can look back and I can see certain behaviors from both of us. I didn't understand tolerance back then. I'm not sure he did either, to be honest.
Mhm.
Um, but now as a coach, I tell people the same thing. You know, you have to take a step inside yourself. It's not so much what that other person is thinking. What are you thinking? How are
Mhm.
you feeling? And you can't blame your feelings on them. And when I
Mhm.
finally did that after almost 30 years after being divorced, I now like my ex-husband.
Mm.
I
Yeah.
like his family. And
Mhm.
it is so much easier to have a relationship even with our son because it's
Hmm.
like, I'm not angry anymore.
Hmm.
So, what are some of the things that, besides coming in and sitting and talking to you in your office or doing it virtually, what are some of the things that you have couples do to regain their composure, to, you know, bring back their intimacy, whether it's in conversation or physically?
Hmm. Well, let me note, you're talking as you're describing your story about you and your ex. You're talking about one of my favorite topics. My most recent book is called Betrayal and Forgiveness. How to navigate the turmoil and learn to trust again. And you were describing what I would use the word forgiveness. When you stopped being angry and you forgave. And it's so interesting because forgiveness doesn't necessarily have to imply that you trust somebody. It doesn't imply you want to stay with somebody. It doesn't imply, people can forgive someone that they still intend to divorce. They can forgive someone that they still intend to have prosecuted. I have examples of that in the book, but that what you described was letting go of that burden. You stopped beating yourself up about it, and you stopped beating him up about it in your mind,
Absolutely.
and all of that relieves you of the burden, and then you can stop and think and realize, and what it sounds like you're saying is you and your ex, two fine people, but not really for each other. It didn't work out well for whatever reasons, but you're still valid people. And that involves, you talk about how can I invite couples to get there. Forgiveness is almost always a part of the story somehow. Because if they're angry with each other, finding a way to let go of that anger, and then they can think clearly about, okay, wait a minute. I don't know if I can trust you, but at least I don't have to be angry at you all the time. Now we can figure out if we can make it go of this relationship. To get there, I it's funny. I'm going to talk about 3 steps to forgiveness.
Okay.
Anytime you hear some clever author, and I'm saying clever ironically, aren't I? Because I'm calling myself one, right? Clever author saying 3 steps to something, it's obviously nonsense. It's not complete nonsense, or I wouldn't say it, but it's partly nonsense. It isn't a simple 3 step, 1, 2, 3, but it's a way of understanding it, and I find it useful, and that's why I talk about it. 3 steps to forgiveness, and step one is always forgive yourself. Now, why should, sometimes people will say, wait a minute, they're the one who fill in the blanks. They're the ones who did the cheating. They're the ones who were terrible. They're the ones who stole our money or, gambled it all away or whatever. Why do I need to forgive myself? Well, there's always an element, or almost always an element, when something bad happens to us that we do blame ourselves. If for nothing else, we blame ourselves for not preventing it or not,
Right.
not seeing it sooner, or how could I let myself be so blind, that kind of thing. It's a natural thing to do. I've talked with adults who were sexually abused as children who still blame themselves for it, even though it happened when they were 3. I mean, it's ridiculous from any kind of rational sense to say that you could have prevented that when you were a 3
Sure.
year old, but they still blame themselves because that is in evolutionary terms, it's a useful thing to do because otherwise the world is completely uncontrollable. So I'd rather blame myself and have the illusion of control than be in a panic all the time. So little kids do that, adults do that. There's always an element of forgiving yourself. And you kind of alluded to it, when you were saying, well, you realized, you were part of it, you're part of that relationship. It wasn't all him. You had to realize, yeah, but you don't have to ask somebody when they called you for a date, why do you want to go out with me?
Right.
As if to say, how could you be so silly as to want to go out with the likes of me? Actually, you're fine, right? Turns out you're fine. That's forgiving yourself is basically a way of saying, or the way you get there is by saying, I knew what I knew and I didn't know what I didn't know. And given that, I was doing the best I could. If I had known more, sure, I could have maybe prevented it, but I didn't. And I just have to accept that. I was a valid person. I didn't know what I didn't know. I'm not crazy. I'm not stupid. I'm not evil. I'm just a human being, and I only knew what I knew. And that's what it feels like to forgive someone. So that's to forgive yourself. That's step one. Step two is to forgive whoever hurt you. And that one I claim, and this claim is probably slightly iffy, but I'm going to claim it anyway. I claim that's a pretty short step from step one, because if you actually have understood, I was doing the best I could, if I actually understand that, I can then extend that same thought to the person who hurt me. ah, damn, I wish they had done better. But given who they were, given what they knew, given the forces operating on them, that's what they came up with. It was wrong. They shouldn't have cheated. They shouldn't have done whatever they did, but that's who they were at that moment. They were kind of doing the best they could, even if it was pretty bad. And now, again, I'm not absolving people of moral responsibility.
Sure.
That's still there, but it's recognizing that, we come up with what we come up with. And when you can accept that, it doesn't mean you say, oh, then it's just fine. I'll have to live with it. You might decide not to live with it,
Right.
but nevertheless, you don't have to be angry anymore. You don't have to be obsessed with it. You can think clearly about it. And it's so interesting because when people get to that step of forgiving whoever hurt them, I've seen this happen quite a lot. One of my favorite examples is somebody I write about in the book who I never met her ex-husband by the time when she came to me for individual work. She was having some issues with her kids and whatever. Her ex-husband was in prison because he had been horrendously violent to both her and the kids. She finally was able to get out. She had to, it was very difficult. She had to make a safety plan because he was a dangerous guy. Um, and that had been several years before I met her. And she said, she'd forgiven him. That doesn't mean she wanted anything to do with him.
Right. Right.
It did mean that she said he was crazy or something. She couldn't explain it, but it's like, well, there's no point being angry about it. She just has to be careful. So she had a restraining order and she actually kept a gun near her bed. I mean, she was under no illusions that this guy was safe, but she didn't have to be angry anymore. And what was fascinating about that was when she was able to process that and not be angry anymore, then she could remember the whole range of experiences she had with him because, she married him because in a lot of ways he was a good guy.
Right.
She could remember the good stuff, even though she was under no illusions that he was safe anymore. So that's what I mean by forgiving whoever hurt you. And the third step, which I think is equally important, and it has a funny name. I give it a funny name. You don't have to be religious to appreciate this name. I call it forgiving God. The
Okay.
third step is
Sure.
forgiving God. And what I mean by that is recognizing, okay, I can forgive myself, I can forgive the person who hurt me, but why do we have to live in a world where that sort of thing happens? Why should that have to happen to people who don't deserve it? And forgiving God is a way of saying, yeah, on some level, there's the forces are what they are, and they kind of have to be that way, or change one thing and you change everything. Why should there be tsunamis that kill innocent
Right.
people? Well, because there are tectonic plates, and if there weren't, we wouldn't have evolved the way we evolved, and it's kind of part of the big picture. Damn, if I could have a chat with God, God would have some serious explaining to do. But I got to recognize, yeah, I don't have a God's eye view of the universe. There's some rightness about the whole thing. That's what I mean by forgiving God. So when you can do that, then you can think clearly. Then you can say, all right, I got to work with this reality rather than resist it. And then I can think clearly about what do I want to do. And then, rebuilding trust with someone is a whole different thing. That's not just about your own process. That requires both people.
Well, one of the things that I have on my computer, and I look at it obviously many times a day, either when I'm coaching or when I'm doing a podcast or just sitting and writing my blogs. And that little sticky note says, how is that working for you?
Hmm.
And I make sure that if I'm upset about anything during the day, that I go and I look at that. And
Hmm.
I have to give myself at least one answer. And if I say it's not working for me, I have a headache, or it's draining me, or I just canceled a client because I didn't feel prepared, then I say to myself, okay, what could you have done differently?
Hmm.
And I wish I had had that many, many years ago,
Hmm.
but I didn't. And many years ago, I went by the philosophies that my grandparents and my parents talked to me about. And that was someday, Karen, you will get married. And it is your job to keep the home happy.
Ah, yes. Well, you're
And
the
so I,
woman after all. Sure.
so I became the doer for everybody.
Hmm.
It didn't make any difference. It was my husband, his family, my family, friends, a neighbor down the road. That's what I was supposed to do. You keep people happy. And it was just about almost 15 years ago, somewhere in that time range. My son was driving me home from work, and he said, "Mom, why are you depressed?" I said, "I'm not depressed." He said, "No, why are you depressed?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." But I knew what it was. I was loving my job, but hating the culture that I was in.
Mm,
And I was taking that demeanor home. So I'd go home and I was making dinner, and I'm sure you heard me flicking the pans and, yelling at people because I couldn't find certain ingredients, and then I would clean up. And by the time I went to bed, I was just so angry, but I didn't know how to be any different.
mm,
But as soon as he pointed it out to me, is when I said, I need help.
mhm.
Now, a lot of us don't see that. Even if somebody points it out to us, we think they're wrong.
Yeah.
Are there any tips you can give listeners that will help them see when they should seek therapy,
Mm,
coaching, or even more intense psychiatric work?
yeah. Yeah. Great question. What comes to my mind is the story you just told. Your first thought was to tell your son, no, no, I'm not. But then you were able to, you actually opened up to it and thought about it and proceeded to get help. And partly I'm thinking, oh, that's because of those two X chromosomes you have. And again, I don't want to over stereotype in terms of the gender difference, but men are usually far more reluctant to acknowledge that than women. So, my advice to many men is when someone, often a woman, often your wife or a woman or someone in your life, tells you they're noticing something about you that you're denying, it's usually, they're not always right, but it's usually a really good idea to listen to the possibility that they know something about you that you haven't admitted to yourself yet. Uh, because men tend to resist that and women tend to resist it less. I'm not saying women don't resist it, but I think
Sure.
women tend to resist it less. Precisely for those same reasons, I think women, because that training that we all got, and both men and women get it, right? That, oh, women are responsible for making sure everybody's happy. That training you get orients you to actually considering what's going on around you and entertaining the possibility that maybe you're part of it.
Right.
And men, we tend to be more arrogant than that. I'm not saying women can't be arrogant, but that's more our brand, and so it's harder for us, I think, to see it. So what should indicate that somebody needs help? I don't have a simple formula for that. It's fascinating when I'm working with a couple, very, very, very often, and again, talking about heterosexual couples here, which is the vast majority of folks I work with, the woman will say to the man, I think you should go to individual therapy too. And the man will be thinking, no, I don't want to do that. There he is in couples therapy. He's
Right.
willing to do that. And I'll often recognize, yeah, the woman is saying that in good faith. She's usually saying it because she's seeing something that he needs the help with. But I mean, it's the light bulb joke about therapists. How many therapists does it take
Yeah.
to change a light bulb? Yeah, just one, but the light bulb has to really want to change.
Yeah.
So if the guy hasn't decided it himself, pushing him into it is probably not going to do any good. And so usually the woman means it and she means it in good faith. Like she say, I think it'll help you, but it doesn't always help somebody unless they've concluded it themselves. So what gets somebody to go to therapy, especially if they're a guy, especially if they're sort of inherently resistant to it, is it feels bad enough that overcomes their fear. The same thing that gets people in the couples therapy. It feels bad enough that it overcomes their fear, their well-founded fear that, wow, this could mean the end. So that's what it takes. And usually you don't need someone to tell you that. Yeah, and I'm not saying people shouldn't tell other people that. It sounds like your son's suggestion to you or your son's observation was very helpful to you
Oh,
ultimately.
extremely. Yeah.
Yeah. But I don't have a formula for saying, oh, this is when you should go. It's like when you're feeling like I don't know what else to do. That's when people usually go, and it makes sense.
And it's interesting because when my son brought it up and I finally accepted it, my son and my husband and I, we sat down to talk about it. And my husband rejected the fact that I was depressed at first.
Yeah, sure.
No, you really aren't. It's everything that you're doing, you'll get over it. And then when my son wasn't there, my husband tried to put the blame on our son,
Hmm.
who's very high functioning autistic, very
Hmm.
independent, but he would bring up, you know, his anger when he has his meltdowns affects you. And he would just go through that whole lineage of different things. And I said, you're right, it does.
Hmm.
And I have to know how to let go of that.
Hmm.
And that's what's making me depressed because I'm waiting for the next shoe to drop. And I
Yeah.
said, and as far as you're concerned, I'm taking out my frustration with him and work on you. So when I come home from work, yes, I kiss you, but I really don't want to talk to you. And he looked
Yeah.
at me and said, but you do. And I said, yes, I do. But we're really not having a conversation. And once I started therapy, in the beginning, he was threatened. I think what he
Hmm.
thought initially, because we've sort of talked about it, is that you're going to go get better and you're going to think that you can do better than me.
Hmm.
And when I explained to him, I want to do better so I can be better with you.
Hmm.
Because at that point, getting better for me was not being without him. And I
Hmm.
had to make him understand. And it probably took a good 6 months of repeating it over and over again. And for him to see the changes in me. Now, I
Hmm.
offered to have him come to therapy with me um, because his first comment was, are you saying nasty things about me? And I said,
Hmm.
if it's a really bad day, not only about you, but my parents and the whole world.
Yep.
Um, and that sort of lightened it up for him because he realized I had this big pot sitting in my stomach that was boiling over, but I
Hmm.
wasn't letting it out.
Yeah.
Can you speak to the fact that not every therapist is the right therapist for the client?
Of course. And look, I'm not so arrogant as to say that I'm the right therapist for every book client I work with either, right? It just isn't the case. Uh, I did write the book I wrote before the most recent one is called It's Not About Communication, Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy is Wrong. Talk about arrogant titles, right? And I hasten to point out, although I did it in one of the last chapters in the book, I mentioned, oh, by the way, that subtitle, Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy is Wrong, applies to me too. Everything I know about couples therapy is wrong too. It's not the, it's not that I don't have good ideas. I wouldn't be writing books and doing this stuff if I didn't think I had good ideas. I do. But there's also all sorts of people who disagree with me who have good ideas too. It's the knowing. It's thinking I know. So if I were going to summarize what what's bad therapy, do you know what I mean? I mean, there's all sorts of things. There's like abusive stuff that happens,
Sure.
but I'm excluding that. What's the therapy that doesn't help much? It's therapy with someone who thinks they know. And very often, and people will have that experience, and I hear the stories. And look, I'll bet there are people telling stories about, unflattering stories about my work with them. I'm sure that exists too. I'm not, as they say, I'm not that arrogant. But it's the knowing part where people will say, well, my therapist said this is what we had to do, and this is the case, and it didn't work out, and I felt terrible. And yeah, because I strive not to do that. I strive to be clear. My training, my expertise, not even so much my training, but my experience and my expertise is in trying to have conversations that will be generative. It's not that I know better than my clients how they should live their lives. I don't. They're the experts on how they want to live their lives and how they should live their lives. It's that if you go in with that curiosity as opposed to certainty, that's what will be helpful. So the therapy that tends not to be helpful are the ones that are just following a script and they're doctrinaire and they don't have room for that sort of intimate conversation where, the neat thing about intimate conversation is when you have three people, like that's what happens in couples therapy, right? When you have three people, the therapist and the couple, sitting there having an intimate conversation, which is to say they're all being honest and sharing whatever they feel is useful. And, obviously my focus is on them, not on me,
Sure.
but I'm sharing what occurs to me. And when we all do that, we're all thinking thoughts we wouldn't have thought without the others in the room. And so we've formed a joint mind that is different from any of our individual minds. And that's growth. That's where growth happens. And it's unpredictable. So, your husband's, I've sort of alluded to this earlier, your husband's fear that, you go off to therapy and you're saying nasty things about him and you might decide, hey, I don't need you. That's not a crazy fear for him to have had at all.
Right.
It could have happened. It sometimes does happen that way. It's one of the reasons I like doing couples therapy more than individual for couples issues, precisely because when everybody's there, they can grow together. And often it's really surprising. And sometimes it's lovely. I mean, my bias is I'm happier when they stay together. That is not people's job to make me happy. But I like it better. But I totally respect often I'll work with a couple and it'll turn out they figure out, wow, we do need to split up, but at least they're in it together.
Exactly.
That's a success too, in my view. But when they can find each other and feel that sense, it's interesting. It sounds like for you and your husband, the one word I would use is commitment. You had that sense. You were not looking to get rid of him or get rid of your marriage. You were looking to feel better yourself and show up better yourself in the marriage. And
Exactly.
that's why you were able to save it, and be better in the marriage. But there are folks who aren't sure about that, and that's a really scary possibility. So all of that, well, as I say, I don't have a simple formula for it, but bad therapy is when that's not what you're getting. Bad therapy is when you're being sort of pushed in a box and maybe it doesn't fit you.
Well, it's interesting because before we got married 41 years ago, we were going through couples therapy. He had never been married because I had been married before. And we were both raising my son from my first marriage. We thought this is really important. And it was the therapist who almost broke us up. So he decided one session just to talk to my husband, and then he came upstairs and he talked to me. When he came upstairs to talk to me, he went through everything my husband had said downstairs, not with my husband's permission. Now, I knew all of this because my husband and I had talked about it.
Mm.
But the way the therapist came to me was, you don't want to get married. I said,
Oh
well, I
my.
do. No, your husband still loves this girl who never looks at him, and just went on and on and on.
Mm.
And I sat there for about 20 minutes, accepting all this being thrown at me. And I finally stood up and I said, you're not telling me not to marry him. I already know all of this. He needed to get it off his chest. He was hoping that you would help him work through it. I
Mhm.
said, did you? And he looked at me. He said, you're not the therapist. I said, you're right. So we're going to go find a new therapist.
Mhm.
You know, he tried to sue us.
The therapist tried to sue
Yeah,
you?
yeah.
Seriously?
Because
What for?
I talked back to him, and I was not helping my husband through whatever his issues were. So what
I
I
can't
always,
imagine what grounds there would be for a lawsuit there.
oh,
That makes no sense
it
to me.
was funny because when he filed, it was, I don't remember exactly what it was, but I contacted my cousin who's an attorney. I said, can you read this? And he read it and he goes, oh, I think you should go to court. You
You
could
countersue.
win big time. And I
Yes.
said, but it never got there because his attorney said, drop it. But
God.
what I learned from that was therapists, coaches, doctors, we're all human. Okay.
Yes, we are.
And we don't always fit with the people who come to us.
Mhm.
And it is really important that if you don't think it's a right fit, whether you are the one who's counseling or the one who's going for counseling, it's okay to go seek someone else.
Oh yeah, and I routinely will say to folks if it seems like, I can't always tell. It's funny. There are three opinions going on in a couples
Right.
therapy. If how's it going? There's three different opinions. Mine being, I would claim, the least important of the, right? They get to decide. But If I'm thinking it's not going well, I will ask that question and I'll often, if they're thinking it's stuck, and I'll say, maybe you would do better with someone else because you're going to get something different from anybody you go to. I have to say, I've heard lots of stories. I haven't heard one like that one before, where the therapist is suing you because you didn't like what
Yep,
he was saying.
yep.
Holy cow. I mean, that is a person, in my humble opinion, who should not be doing therapy, and I trust isn't anymore.
He's not anymore.
Yeah, that's good to know because that's astonishing.
Yeah,
That I was trying to say. The only thing I can imagine a therapist legitimately suing somebody for is if they don't get paid. It's
yeah.
like, okay,
What exactly?
that's
Yeah,
the deal.
yeah.
Yes, you do have to pay me. I mean, that is our contract, and if you don't, well, I suppose I could sue you. But for you, the fact that you didn't like what he was offering and talk back to him, holy cow, that's
It was quite interesting, and I learned over the years between going for further therapy for myself, having my youngest son in therapy due to his autism. There were times that we would just say, this isn't working, we're going to go find
yeah,
somebody new. And
yeah,
never blamed the therapist. It
hmm
just, you don't seem to be connecting. Uh,
yeah,
I work with 3 different coaches, and I always laugh about it because it's like, well, this coach helps me here, and this
hmm
one helps me here, and this one sort of helps me. And it's like, so when do you decide, what do I need right now? How's
yeah.
it working for me? And that's
hmm
how I know who to go to. So I offer that up to our listeners. But what I'd like to know is, how can our listeners find you, get your books, and if they're interested in couples therapy, connect with you?
Easiest way is go to my website, which is simply brucechalmer.com. So if they spell my name right, they'll get it, brucechalmer.com. And that will give you information on my practice, also information about how to find my books. My wife, I'll put in a plug for the podcast that my wife, Judy Alexander, and I do. It's called Couples Therapy in 7 Words. I suppose I'll tell you the 7 words. The
Sure.
7 words, and I know probably more people are hearing this than seeing it, but we even have it on merch. It's on a cup.
I
Be
don't panic.
kind,
And
don't
I love
panic.
them.
Yes, and there's the logo that my wife designed. So we do that, and you can find a link to that on brucechalmer.com, or you can go to our podcast website, CT in seven, the number seven, ctin7.com, couples therapy in 7 words. So
Wow.
that's how people can find information about me and the stuff I do.
Well, we'll have that all in the show notes. And I want to thank you for joining me. For those of you listening prior to Dr. Bruce and I getting online, wonderful Zoom messed us up, but we figured it out because I knew this was going to be a great conversation. So thank you for joining me, and have a beautiful day.
You too. Thanks for having me
Thank
on.
you. Bye-bye.